Hello, this is the RPG Pundit, the final boss at Internet Shitlords. And today I'm here to talk to you about how D&D and RPGs in general are not games that you use to make stories. Now, I've had some discussions lately on Twitter with some people, and I realized that there's a whole generation of new gamers that did not go through this debate back in the year 2000 or so, when there was this big discussion about RPGs versus story games and why it is that the role-playing game is not a game designed to tell a story. And it doesn't help that you still have a whole bunch of people, mostly stupid people, but some evil people also, combination of the two, working together to keep pushing this idea on newer players that RPGs are designed to tell a story. We know that they aren't, when you think about it, right? What's the ideal structure? Even if you were doing a collective operation with various people to try to collectively make a collaborative story, the model of the role-playing game would not be the way to do that. There's just too much uncertainty in it. It's not, too much of a focus on mechanics. It's not the system created for that, right? And it's a system that pushes you specifically to something completely different, which is to embody characters in a kind of a virtual world, and to connect deeply with those characters through the experience of playing them. Okay, so that's what you're doing. Now, do stories happen? Well, people tell stories about their games, right? So, that's a story, right? And the worlds have a background, and that's sort of a story, right? But neither of those are story in the literary sense, which is what people tend to imagine RPGs do. And that's not what they do. They do not tell a story in the literary sense. They tell a story in the sense of a history. If you're looking at a setting or something like that, a setting will have its history as a story. And they can tell a story in the sense of an emergent experience. Okay, emergent is a very important term here, because the sense of reality of a game will increase the longer you play it, the more time you spend playing it, the longer you play your character, the more real that the character will become. That's what emergent means. It means that the reality of this world that you've created will emerge gradually over time. And story emerges as a result of that, in the same way that history emerges out of the passage of time, right? It's not something that you're actively doing. It's something that results from things that you're actively doing. You make choices in your life, you make mistakes, or you have great successes, things go well, things go badly, and at the end of all that, what's happened? Well, there's a story to tell, but it's not that you set out at the beginning, at the beginning of your life to go and tell some kind of a story, and that everything you've done has been some kind of a cynical attempt to end up with a story at the end of it, right? You tell a story as a coincidental side effect of having lived through a life, right? And at the end of your life, hopefully you've got a bunch of stories. Hopefully they aren't all just boring stories, right? Because hopefully you did things, you adventured in your life, right? And it's the same thing in an RPG. In an RPG, in D&D, in Lion and Dragon, in Heirs of Indra, in any role-playing game that is actually a real role-playing game, that you can define as a regular role-playing game. That's a definition from the wars of the 2000s, right? The role-playing versus story game wars, which I'm going to go into more detail about here. By that definition, in a role-playing game, you are playing out this character and he's having adventures, right? And that in that process of having adventures, story happens, but it happens after, right? It's called story after, right? It's something that happens as a side effect. Now, how, maybe you could just say, well, Pundit, I'm getting the feeling you don't like stories very much. Well, I love myth, right? And I love legend, and I love history, and I love all that stuff. I love the symbols of myth. I love the legends of myth. All of that. So it's not that I don't enjoy literature, right? It's that this is the case. But you don't have to take my word for it, right? The biggest proponents of people who said RPGs don't make stories, you can't make story with D&D in an effective way, are people that desperately wanted to make story out of role-playing games, right? These were the people that examined this. Now, what happened? Back in the 1990s, we're talking about ancient history here, children. listen, Miss Petite Enfant, and you'll hear that back in 1990, you had, the biggest role-playing game in the world was Dungeons and Dragons, but you had this kind of upstart that came along that pulled this kind of marketing angle that it was not really the first time this had been pulled. And it was called Vampire the Masquerade, and the writer of that game said that its game was a storytelling game. And they called their system, in fact, the storytelling system. And why? Because it was so much more pretentious and sophisticated and intellectual than D&D, and it was so much better in every way, right? And this, unlike that horrible D&D, will allow you to tell stories. Why? Well, because you're going to be rolling pools of D10 dice instead of 1d20, and because you're going to have skills that are based on socially manipulating people. So you'll roll dice to determine how you've manipulated people instead of just role-playing it. Those are things that are going to make story much more effective. Right? So that was the argument of the storytelling game, the storytelling system, Vampire. To this day, just yesterday, somebody on Twitter said, how can you say that RPGs aren't about making story? There's the Vampire game is called a storytelling game, dumbass, right? Well, yeah, because it was a marketing ploy, right? And a number of people looked at this. They said, yes, this is what we want. We want to tell stories. We want to tell really sophisticated stories. And they got Vampire and started playing it. And they realized, well, hang on, this is just an RPG. It's not even exactly like D&D. In some ways, it's worse, right? Because suddenly you've got these social skills. And this means that if I have, 7 dice in Intimidate, I don't even have to role play it. I just roll the dice and that intimidates a person, right? And so it's not really doing role playing well, but it's also not making it any easier to craft a real story. And these people from White Wolf, all they're doing is they have this meta plot that they've decided on, right? And I don't know what the hell's going on with my phone. It's like migrating to all directions here. Like, this is weird. Normally it just kind of sinks, but this guy's like sinking, going up. It's doing like this whole little dance. All right, anyway. So the storytelling people at White Wolf, they said, well, the story is in our meta plot. We're the authors, and we're going to write these wonderful stories and adventures, and you're going to have to follow them if you want to buy the next book. And that drove this whole thing in the 90s of a number of games ripping off Vampire that had, and eventually D&D among it, which it was one of the reasons why it ended up going bankrupt, that started copying this idea of metaplot, which is, a bunch of game designers who are really frustrated authors. They really wanted to be international best-selling writers. Their English degree was worthless, and they ended up working for an RPG company, decided they were going to write their novels through RPG supplements, right? And I mean, at least that really is story making, but guess what? It's really crappy play. Because you're going through these adventures of these meta-plot heavy 1990s adventures and source books and what have you, and you realize that your player characters are just cheerleaders. All they're there for is to watch the really incredible and interesting and intelligent story that this game designer who's never met you made and wants to force you to watch. Because you can't do anything to stop it, because the meta-plot depends on everybody following the same meta-plot. So your player characters can't prevent certain things from happening. They can't defeat certain NPCs. They can't actually have anything significant as an element of agency for themselves, right? So that effort to try to tell story through metaplot was basically based on this kind of pretentious elitism of the White Wolf writers and then other writers in the hobby. And I'm not just blaming White Wolf, though they started it. That decided that, well, no, that's not even fair, because Dragonlance did the same thing earlier. It's just White Wolf perfected it. But these people decided that you were meant to be their captive audience, right? And so they were writing a story, that's true, and you were meant to play out that story exactly as it was written. Why? Because D&D otherwise doesn't let you make a good story. If you're trying to make a story, and if you're trying to, if the DM or the game writer is making this masterful plot, and the player characters have freedom of choice, they're going to screw up that plot every time, and they're going to make it really wacky and weird and disjointed and not literary enough to be a story, right? So this was the sort of stuff that some people who really wanted story started to look at. One of them was a guy named Ron Edwards, who took a look at all this And he really hated White Wolf because he hated D&D, but he hated White Wolf worse because they had tried to sell the fact that they were doing story and they weren't, right? Because D&D at least wasn't, pretending to be something it wasn't. But White Wolf and Vampire and the story gaming movement, to him, they were the real traitors because they'd promised him something that they weren't going to give him, right? So he kind of analyzes, and not just him, a number of people in the 90s, the late 90s and the early 2000s were analyzing this, and everybody involved in that, myself included, came to certain conclusions. The conclusions were, normal RPGs cannot be used effectively to tell normal stories in the sense of what most people imagine stories to be, right? As in linear plots that have a coherent substance that are derived from a theme. Trying to do so requires either something called illusionism, which is where you give your characters the idea that they have free choice, but you're really just leading them always in the same direction, right? The classic example of illusionism is you see a corridor, you can go left or right. And if the players say, okay, we're going right, then they're going to end up in the place where you want them to be. And if they say we're going left, they're going to end up in the place where you want them to be. The choice is an illusion. Either way, they're going to keep going straight to the plot you've crafted for them, or that the writer of the adventure crafted. Right, so it depends on illusionism or railroading, which is an even more blatant form of that, which is where they really literally just don't have a choice, right? That they are moved by force if necessary from one scene to another, where they're supposed to watch and applaud, as you are making this incredible adventure story for yourself, or the guy that wrote the module made it for themselves, right? And then the only thing that is reminiscent of story that can be created out of RPG actual play is what's called story after, which is story that emerges as a side effect of stuff that happened in the adventure, right? So the same way that if you go fishing, later you have fishing stories to tell, right? Or if you go hunting, you got hunting stories to tell, or golf stories, right? You don't go to play golf for the stories. I don't really know why you go to play golf. It's a good walk ruined, but okay. I'm sure the people who go to play golf, who like going to play golf, they don't know, they don't go there, rather, because they want to create a story. They go there because they want to play a game of golf, I'm guessing. Or to go drink at the country club or something. But the point is that this is a side effect. It's a consequence. It might be something that people really value as a side effect, right? I'm sure that, fishing, a lot of the fun of fishing after the fishing is over, during the fishing, nobody's thinking about making story. You're thinking about catching that fish, right? Afterwards, though, part of the fun is hanging out with some friends and telling them about the one that got away, of course, right? But that's not story. That's an anecdote. It's not literature, right? You didn't take an active role in creating it. It produces itself in the course of play. And then the only thing in which we differed in this perspective is that, myself and Ron Edwards, for example, who were two of the biggest fighters of this conflict, right, is that his conclusion was, well, then what we need to do is radically alter RPGs and force them to be something different, right? And force people to play these games that are different from how typical RPG was being made. And it'll actually be a superior experience, right? Because we'll actually be creating story. And most people really, and this was his theory, he theorized most people wanted to create story in RPGs. And hence there's, one of the things that came out of his papers on this, he wrote an enormous, sprawling pseudo-academic diatribes and documents on this, right? And in one of them, he basically started by saying that almost everyone who plays RPGs is secretly miserable, right? That they think they're going to get what they want from an RPG, but they're not, and so they're deep down they're not happy. They just don't know it. They need someone like him to show them what's wrong, right? To show them that the games that they're playing are incoherent. That was one of the lingos he had. And that you can make a new type of game that's going to be a game that will actually create story, right? It turned out that almost all of his conclusions based on the analysis he'd done were wrong, right? Most people didn't prefer to play story games. There was a whole story game movement that came out in the early 2000s and the mid 2000s, and there's still some around today. right? They've been mostly ignored by the mainstream. The mainstream doesn't want games for creating story. Those story games are not like RPGs. They don't do the same thing. They're set up for you to collaboratively create a story with your friends using certain mechanics, but it's not the same way. The character, you're not supposed to care as much about your character. You're supposed to care about creating the story. This was one of the points I argued in these debates, is that in story, the story gamings is different from role-playing games because there's an inevitable conflict about what you want, what your priority is in the game. Is your priority to play your character, or is your priority to create a story? You can't have both as the first priority. So you have to, if you care more about being your character and playing out your character and the character acting the way you think he should act, realistically in this virtual world, then you're not out to create a story, because the story depends on sometimes other stuff being more important, right? If you want your universe to feel like a real universe, you need to, for it to be immersive, then you can't have story as the first priority, because story depends on you being able to have a malleable universe. And that's why most story games have mechanics where players, or the DM, but more often players, can spend a point to say, oh, and now suddenly this happens, or what if in the kingdom over there was this thing, right? And so like they're just recreating the universe as they go along. They're not actually playing in a D&D type world that's meant to be a coherent virtual world. They're just using setting as a backdrop for the story that can be altered. Anything behind the scenes can be altered as need be to serve the story, right? This is what most literature does with setting, right? Like you aren't, you're not trying to, you're sticking to consistency, but you're not trying to make a world that will really matter outside of the one story you're trying to tell in that world, right? There are very few, even in fantasy, very few fantasy worlds that are made really for a lot of adventuring. And it's one of the problems with Lord of the Rings. Lord of the Rings was made to tell one story or one collection of stories. After that, it's not really that good of a place to adventure in, because the whole world was set up to make that world, to make that adventure happen, right? That one epic story. That's what it was there for. The rest of the time, it's kind of boring. Whereas an adventuring D&D gaming world is going to be set up in a way that you can be way more open, because the setting is meant to be like a real world, and the thing that matters is that it's a real world. And there are some worlds in literature that are like that, but then those are usually things that aren't seen as proper in the context of literature. So anyways, the point is that the other side, the story gaming side, was so determined that this was, that they were just as recognizing as I was of the fact that D&D is not something that creates story. And they were so determined to have a game that would create story that they made a whole other genre of games, story games, right? And most of those story games didn't turn out to be popular, and as a whole, they never succeeded in Ron Edwards' belief that they would end up overwhelming and replacing RPGs, right? To a certain extent, because he thought that some RPGs could be reduced to what they were really meant to be, which was just like, exalted tactical simulation games, right? He had this division of GNS rather, a gamist, narrativist, and simulationist, and the one that mattered was narrativist, which was story gaming, right? And then the other two were other, stuff that you could make out of RPGs, because he thought that all RPGs were a mix of those three ideas of having elements of story, but they don't really do story, having elements of a war game, but they don't really do war games, and then having some weird other thing that he never understood, because I think there's something missing in him. I don't know. But that other thing is what RPGs are actually meant to be, is a simulation. They're meant to be a virtual world, and you're meant to play a character in that virtual world. And and from his point of view, he couldn't get that. So what he said was, the problem is games each should be their one thing, right? So you can play our story games, which are narrativist, or you could remake D&D into what he thought it's meant to be, which is just basically like a video game type game where you're going around killing things, and that has a really big focus on combat encounters and on powers and, special abilities and all this. The people who were in charge at Wizards of the Coast around the mid-2000s ended up believing his side, his theories, his gaming theories, as being like the way of the future. And this explains a lot about 4th edition D&D. 4th edition D&D is a gamist game according to the structure that Ron Edwards and the Story Gaming Forge crowd thought up. And so that was like their idea of saying, well, yeah, this is how it's going to work. And according to Ron Edwards, if you make a game more gamist, so 4E isn't completely perfect because, just like it's like communism, there'll never be the perfect ideal communism, and that's why they can then excuse their failures, right? But the game was gamist enough, and according to the theory, if you made D&D more gamist, if you took away all that other stuff, that other weird simulation stuff and all that, and you just made it a game about, having these, characters with all these rules, and you go and you play these combat encounters that last 90 minutes to go through a fight with some goblins or whatever, and all of that stuff. The more gamist you make it, the more people are going to like it. And I told, at the time, I predicted, when it came out, it was on my blog, I said, they've made this game based on GNS theory. The result is going to be Wizards of the Coast will lose 2/3 of their market, because most people actually like a game that has all three things in it. They like what the Forge crowd calls incoherent, right? So they didn't believe me. They made it anyways. It was a huge failure. And for 5th edition, as soon as 5th edition was announced, what did they do? They came looking for me. And I gave them my philosophical advice for 5th edition, and it's the most successful edition they ever made. So that's kind of the end of the story of the war between story gaming and traditional gaming. But the important part out of all of this, as it matters in current year, is that you have a lot of people who haven't had time to learn about all this history, haven't seen this and haven't thought it through. And when somebody tells you RPGs aren't for making stories, you better look up all this. You better know all this context, because smarter people than you have had this debate for a long time and have been wrong about it, at least in smarter ways than you have, right? You're probably a 20-year-old player. 10 years ago, you were 10, dude. There's nothing you're going to show to me that I haven't thought through already and worked out. So think about this, and then think about how it is in the context of how you play and what it is you really want. Because the fact is, we know the failure of story gaming tells us that we know that not only are RPGs not meant to be for playing stories, for making stories, but also that most players don't actually want RPGs to be for making stories. If they did, story gaming would have worked. So that's not even what you actually want from D&D. You do not want to make a story from D&D. So then think about what you do want. Think about what you do want to get out of it. And what you want to get out of it is to be able to inhabit the body of this character you are playing. Or if you're the DM, to be able to create a world that becomes so real that it gets away from you, okay? Immersion. That's the thing that most people actually want from their experience of playing RPGs. And that's what you should be looking into. And maybe I'll try to explain more about that in a future video, but this has gotten too long already. So if you like this video, please support me on Patreon. For while I'm still there. Like I said, as soon as the Ruben Peterson alternative actually appears, I'll be switching, but for now I'm there. If you don't want to support me on Patreon because you're banning Patreon, you're not backing it, then, or just otherwise you never had it or whatever, go to my blog. The link is in the description below. To the right, there's a PayPal button, and you can support me there. Your support will allow me to make more videos and more frequent videos. And so if you like this stuff, you want to learn more about this sort of stuff, you want to hear me rant more, you want me to talk more about other stuff, tell me what you want me to talk about in the comments. I'll be glad to consider any subjects. And most of all, if you haven't subscribed yet, subscribe and share this video. Share it everywhere. We've gotten, I can't believe how many subscribers I've already got. And it grows a little every day, and I'm so pleased. So I'm very grateful to everyone who has subscribed. If you haven't yet, be sure to subscribe. But if you've already subscribed, then share the video so that everybody can see it and find out about it and debate it. Okay? Thank you very much. Currently smoking Moretti Rhodesian plus barking dog.